So I got a request on one of my videos the other day from Luke. Shout out to Luke. And he asked me a question. Could you do a video discussing what things you would change about boxing? And I got thinking about it, and I thought actually it would potentially be an interesting topic to get into. So I've had a bit of a think. I'm going to be honest, I've spent 10 minutes preparing this, not a few hours. So this list is 10 things that I've thought of on the hop that I would like to change about the sport. Now, it's not specific to one element of the sport, you know, it's not specific to promoters or managers or fights or governing bodies, etc. Just 10 things basically that sprung to my mind that I associate at times with boxing that I personally would like to change. If something isn't included on this list, doesn't mean that I wouldn't like to change it, just means that for whatever reason it wasn't in the first 10 things that sprung to my mind. So we're going to discuss that here and now. Of course, more interesting than just my thoughts is the discussion. So do leave your things that you'd like to change within the sport in the comments section below. And let's see if any of the things that I mentioned come up in your list. But anyway, in no particular order, one of the first things that I would like to change in boxing is the ridiculous notion that when somebody gets hit on the belt, that it's in some way a low blow. Now look, I'm here to talk boxing, I'm not here to give you guys a biology lesson, but I'm sure we all know where, in terms of the positioning in the body, are the gentleman's bits that you wouldn't want to hit if you were trying to avoid going for a low blow. And the way these boxers wear their shorts, you know, realistically the belt covers the belly button. It's kind of up on the sort of abdominal region, if you like, of a person's body, and it's ridiculous. Regularly you see fighters landing a punch on the belt and the boxer going down or reacting like he's been hitting his balls. Now for me there's two options when something like that happens. Option number one is that the boxer's aware that their opponent has hit them on the belt and has decided to go down to take a dive, if you like, to try and score a point for being low blowed. Or option number two is that the boxer's taken one to the body and has been dropped by a perfectly legitimate body shot. For me, the definition of a low blow should be if you hit someone below the waist. It shouldn't have any relation to their shorts. And even though the referees will often have a look at the start of a fight and go, right, this belt line is high, you know, regularly you see it, that fighters simply are not allowed to hit on the belt. Now, what I think is that, to be perfectly honest, any part of the body, let's say belly button and above, should be a perfectly legitimate target zone. And I really don't like the trend that, you know, boxers are simply allowed to go down, or boxers are allowed a 5-minute break if someone hits them on the belt. You know, it should be nothing to do with the belt. I think that's something that needs to be stopped, and I think that's got a negative influence on the sport and potentially affects some of the body punchers out there. So that's something I personally have observed that annoys me. Another thing that annoys me, and obviously, you know, this is something that I guess most people are going to agree with, are the ridiculous scorecards that we see time and time and time again in the sport. That really means the sport loses some credibility as far as I'm concerned. We had one just last week where one judge scored about 118 to 110 in favour of Ricky Burns against Kirill Relik. 118 to 110, that judge could only find 2 rounds that Kirill Relik was successful in. If we think back to Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo, another one that really sticks in my mind, where CJ Ross scored the fight a draw. You know, how on earth that could be scored a draw? I think it'd be easier to score that fight a whitewash 12-0 than it would be to score it a draw. You know, these ridiculous scorecards are something that come up time and time again. Now, boxing's a subjective sport. I appreciate that people are going to look at the fight and see things in a different way. I appreciate that there's going to be a difference of opinion. But for me, anyone who looks at Ricky Burns, Kirill Relik, and says Relik only won 2 rounds, or anyone who looks at Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo and says that Canelo won 6 rounds, really do not understand boxing, and do not understand boxing at a level where they should be judging. So I know it's a hard thing to change. In many ways, this is an idealistic point. But if we're talking about things that I'd like to change in boxing, certainly the ridiculous scoring of certain fights would be one of those that we'd obviously look to remove from the sport. Number 3, I would like to remove the WBA regular title. Now, there's a lot of people who would say, oh, we need one belt per division. I think there's strong arguments for that, but also strong arguments against that. I think in this day and age where fights can be so difficult, so politically complex to actually make in the first place, it can create good fights when multiple belts become available. A recent example would be the suggestion of Tyson Fury potentially being stripped. Well, we may see Vladimir Klitschko versus Lucas Brown come out of that. We may see Joseph Parker versus Andy Ruiz come out of that. These are fights that probably wouldn't be made without belts. So there is a positive to me to having multiple belts. Obviously, there's negatives as well, don't get me wrong, but we can discuss that another day. But the WBA regular belt for me is a belt that I don't like. It's confusing. Frankly, it is confusing and it makes no sense. I understand the idea of having a champion. I can even, under certain circumstances, understand why you'd have an interim champion. If a fighter's injured and they want to have someone who's a belt holder, by all means have an interim champion. But a regular champion and an interim champion in the instance when there's an active super champion or regular champion is bizarre. It adds no real purpose other than to create sanctioning fees. Really, it's a belt for the sake of having a belt. How can you be champion of a division if there's one champion above you, if there's two champions above you? And there's a lot of fighters who this happens to. The heavyweight division is perhaps where it's best known, but Scott Quigg had the WBA regular title. Danny Jacobs currently has the WBA regular title. And it kind of allows those guys to behave and act as if they're world champions when they're not even the number one in their division within their relevant sanctioning bodies, or often they're not. So, yeah, I am not against having multiple belts. I'm not against having interim belts under a very select set of circumstances. What I am against is when you've got an active super champion, there's no need to have an active regular champion. That person should be known as a number one contender, not a regular champion. And if we referred to them as a number one contender, we'd probably see much, much more fights between number one contender and super champion. Look at Triple G Golovkin. That's a harder fight to negotiate a split on because Jacobs believed he's a regular champion. If he was just a number one contender, then that may be an easier fight to make. So yeah, that regular title annoys me. So that's number 3. Number 4 that annoys me, it's cringeworthy, is fake bad blood. Now, I like bad blood in the build-up to a boxing fight. For me, I'm one of those fans. I'm not all about the pure boxing action inside of the ring. I like the story. I like the EastEnders build-up. I like it when insults are being slung. I like it when there's heat at the weigh-in. But sometimes when there is fake bad blood, it is cringeworthy. Recent examples, I'm afraid they're both going to be matchroom examples. Callum Smith versus Rocky Fielding, but most notably, like the worst one, Tommy Coyle versus Luke Campbell. 2 guys who came up through the ranks together, 2 guys who were friends as youngsters, 2 guys who were clearly on at least decent terms, overnight decided there was some history and some bad blood there, and it really didn't sell. Certain characters, very charismatic characters, very good talkers, maybe they could sell it. But guys like Tommy Coyle, guys like Luke Campbell, hardly the leading charismatic actors in the sport, if you like. For me, it was uncomfortable viewing. It was cringeworthy, and it really, really didn't help build the fight. It didn't get me excited for the fight. It just embarrassed me. And it made us look like a sort of poor version of WWE to the casual observer. So that's number 4. So let me just have a recap. Number 1 was this hitting on the belt. You should be allowed to hit to the body, regardless of where the belt is. Number 2, ridiculous scoring. Number 3, regular titles. Number 4, fake bad blood. Let's move on to number 5. The schedule timing of shows. I have been to multiple bills where the bill ends too late to watch all the fights and to get home in time. You know, promoters should be more aware of public transport, specifically in London. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, one that springs to mind. I went to see a Frank Warren bill when Frank was working with Derek Chisora, and Derek Chisora was the co-main event on the card. So I stayed for the main event, and then Derek Chisora came out to the ring at about 11:30 for the co-main event. And myself and my brother, who'd gone to the fights last night, we wanted to see Derek Chisora fight, but we couldn't stay and watch him because I think the bill was in Wembley. The last tube was at a certain time, and if we missed it, we'd have been stuck in Wembley facing an hour-long queue for a taxi and then a £60 taxi fare to wherever we were going, you know. And I think that's poor from a promotional perspective. It's not complex. If you're scheduling an 8-round fight, you should be aware that that fight takes, or could take, 8 3-minute rounds and 8 1-minute breaks. Then you have 5 minutes till the next fight comes out, which is a 10-round. That can take 30 minutes of fighting and 10 minutes of break. Then you have a 5-minute break. You know, it's easy enough to schedule this. And time again, bills overrun. And it can really add to the cost for boxing fans of attending these things if they can't be confident of getting public transport to and from. At times, depending on the location of bills, it's put me off attending, if I'm honest. Now, obviously, bills can be difficult to plan because if you've got 15 fights on a bill and several of them end in first round knockouts, you can quickly get ahead of schedule. But there's an easier solution there. Number one, end the show slightly earlier. It's no disaster if the show is finished at 11. It doesn't have to finish at 11:45 exactly. Number two would be, if there is a first round break, a first round knockout, you either leave a slightly longer gap or you have floating 4-rounders that you can bring in. You know, use floating fights more, which don't have a specific pinpointed schedule on the bill. But the main event, as far as I'm concerned, I think the co-main event should start at 9, a main event should start at 10. You know, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating if this particular Derek Chisora fight that stands to mind. I mean, Chisora must have been fighting in front of 500 people, and it had previously been a packed-out Wembley Arena because so many people were in the same boat as me. So that's something I'd change. That's something I'd look to try and put stricter rules on. Number 6. Semi-elite fighters in 6-rounders. What I'm talking about here, and there's 2 fighters that particularly get my goat with this, Paul Smith and Martin Murray. What we see with them, the pattern is world title fight or big name fight, followed by 6-rounder against a woeful journeyman who we haven't heard of. And for me, it is really, really frustrating and terrible viewing, and it's enough to turn anyone off the sport. If a casual fan is tuning in after the football talks a bit of boxing, they've got to sit through Paul Smith in 8 messy rounds against a journeyman. It really, really is painful viewing. Now, I don't mind seeing a 5-0 prospect fighting a journeyman. I don't mind seeing a showcase fight, something like that. I don't even mind seeing a fight where the levels are slightly different and there's potential for a brutal knockout. But what I really don't like seeing is a clumsy, a clumsy fight where no clean punches are landing, loads of hugging, a journeyman who's just come to survive against a sort of ranked fighter who is in the peak of their career. These fights should be there to build up prospects, but for me, the idea of having to sit through another John Ryder 8-rounder, another Paul Smith 6-rounder, really, at that point, I'm on my phone, I'm flicking through Twitter, I'm flicking through Facebook. You know, I'm a boxing nut. When the boxing's on, because it's not on enough, when it's on, we should be really excited for the fights. We should be glued to the box. And, those sort of fights really, really annoy me. Those sort of needless 6-rounders for named fighters. One of the seventh thing that I changed about the sport is the typical boxing fan, and when I say typical boxing fan, I probably mean more of a casual fan as opposed to the people who tune into my channel, but the fans' obsession with power. You know, time and time again, we see fighters who have a little bit of power pushed to the front. They are the fighters who the fans get all over. They're the fighters with technique, fighters with fundamentals in the ring are often ignored compared to those who carry a bit more power. Let me give two classic examples that spring to mind. Tyson Fury and David Price, they were coming up at the same time. David Price was a huge and heavy favourite to win that fight because of his power, because he was knocking people out. David Price was the fan favourite there. Nobody looked at the skills of Tyson Fury, or, well, I did. Certainly some people did. I'm not saying nobody. But, you know, it was like a ludicrous suggestion to say that Tyson Fury could win that fight back in the day, because all people were obsessing about was the power. I'll give another example. Let's look at two Frank Warren promoted light heavyweights, Anthony Yarde, Tom Baker. Now, Anthony Yarde is a very, very, very good prospect, so this is in no way to derogate Anthony Yarde. But Anthony Yarde carries power. He's been given a huge push. He was taken out to fight on the Canelo undercard in Texas. He's been given more exposure. Tom Baker, he's a guy who lacks power, but he's a guy who, to my eye, is a supreme technician. His fundamentals in the ring are elite. I could see Tom Baker potentially having the potential to go on and be a world champion. I really could. I think he's that good. But who's the one that the fans are hearing of? Anthony Yarde. Who's the one who's getting the push? Who's the one who's getting the promotion? So I don't know where the issue is here. I don't know if it's a fan issue. It probably is. I don't know if it's a promotion issue. It's probably a combination of the two. But I would like to see less emphasis placed purely on a fighter's power, less emphasis placed on a fighter's knockout ratio, and more emphasis from a fan perspective on seeing the guys with skill. I think we should be just as excited to see a Hughie Fury, to see a Bradley Skeet, to see a Tom Baker, as we are a knockout artist. That's my take on it. I appreciate everyone's got an opinion, and if you disagree with me, that's not to say either one of us is wrong. You know, fundamentally, these guys with power are the ones who are more successful from a business perspective. But I would like to see, I think that's an unfortunate and growing trend in the sport, and I would like to see the guys who have the skill and the technical ability pushed harder. Number 8, opponent TBA 2 days before an event. Now, this happens regularly on small hall shows, and I can understand why it happens on small hall shows, but it's also happening more and more regularly on big shows. I think Eddie Hearn had a number of bills recently where even the day before, several big-name fighters were TBA. I checked BoxRec a couple of days ago. It's probably changed now, but literally 2 or 3 days ago, I checked BoxRec for the Liverpool bill that Matchroom are doing. And there's big-name fighters, Callum Smith v TBA, Paul Smith versus TBA. It's really poor. It's really poor that the opponents are being brought in at that late notice. It's really poor that there's no announcement. It's really poor that fans who have bought a ticket don't know what fights they're going to see. And frankly, it's not good for the sport if opponents are being brought in on that late notice, having to make weight at that late notice. And this actually ties in with point number 9, which is tactically giving fighters late notice. You know, let's talk about my interview with David Allen a few weeks back that I did on the channel. You know, Dave Allen had been pestering Eddie Hearn for a David Price fight for weeks and weeks and weeks. He actually agreed a deal with Eddie Hearn to take the David Price fight on 3 or 4 weeks' notice. Then it all went quiet, and then the offer came back firmly in a time frame that allowed David Allen only 1 week for training. I think that's wrong. I think fundamentally that's wrong, and it's meaning that the sport is in no way competitive. You know, let's factor in that David Price is the big fighter, with the big promoter, with the big amateur pedigree, with the big fan base. Let's bring that in, that he'll be fighting on his promoted show. Let's bring it in that he'll be fighting in front of judges, you know, on a home show. So all those natural advantages would be against Dave Allen. And then to make it worse, they give him a week or 2 weeks notice. You know, it's almost, you wonder at that stage whether it's almost tactical. And it happens a lot in the heavyweight division, because heavyweights have a tendency to blow up extensively between fights. But let's look at another example, Dillian Whyte versus Ian Lewison, or Dillian Whyte versus David Allen, actually. David Allen, again, the unlucky victim. Ian Lewison and David Allen both brought in on only a few weeks' notice. And both of them put up semi-respectable performances against Dillian Whyte. You know, it leaves me unsatisfied as a fan. I genuinely watched that Lewis and White fight, unclear who the better fighter was, unclear who the bigger talent was, unclear who had the highest potential upside, because the late notice that Ian Lewison had received for the fight, for me, dictated how the fight went, and that's disappointing. That's not what I want to see personally as a boxing fan. I want to know who the better man is in the ring. Now, I know late notice fights, sometimes they're part of the business and they're completely unavoidable, but you wonder sometimes if it's tactical. I mean, if they wanted to make David Price Dave Allen, and David Allen had agreed to fight 3 or 4 weeks in advance, it just seems a bit foul play for me to not confirm it and then offer it to him again, knowing he needs the money on a week or two's notice. And fair play to David Allen, he didn't take the fight. And now Eddie Hearn's saying that David Allen can fight David Price in November. And guess what? David Allen still hasn't had the fight confirmed as far as I'm aware. So who knows? Who knows? Maybe Dave Allen will be left in limbo for another 2 or 3 weeks and then be offered it in a fight he might not be able to, refuse in a couple of weeks' time when he's got a bit less notice. I don't like it. I think it's ugly. I think it makes the sport uncompetitive. So number 8 and 9 are linked. 8 is TBA, opponents a few days before the event. Number 9 is tactically offering fighters fights at late notice so they can't turn up in the shape required. Number 10, something that I don't like about this sport, useless 20-0 fighters. We see this time and time and time again. It does no one any good. Not the fighter, not the fan, not even their managerial, as far as I'm concerned. For a fighter to get to 15-0, 20-0, without having a proper fight. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. If you've got a supreme talent or a supremely marketable fighter, like Conor Benn, I can understand why you would get him to 20-0, because he's worth such a big amount of money in terms of his future and his potential that it makes business sense to build his profile by constantly putting him in showcase fights. But time and time again, you see fighters getting to 15-0 who have very little marketability, sell very few tickets, and really don't look like they are world beaters. It just seems that the basic managerial handbook tells managers and tells promoters to get fighters to 10-0 or 15-0, and I don't actually think it does anyone any good. Let's give another example. Let's look at the Frank Warren show last week. Great fight between Jez Smith and Macaulay McGowan. One of them was 10-0, one of them was 7-0, I think. Now, both of those guys could easily have been managed to getting to 15-0. But fundamentally, let's be honest, neither of those guys are likely to end up as world champions. Neither of those guys are likely to end up selling out arenas. Neither of those guys you would think are going to dramatically improve in terms of their skill sets if they had 2 or 3 more 4-rounders on untelevised undercards. So what Frank actually did is put the 2 guys together, created a very entertaining fight, raised both of their profiles, and regardless, I know the fight ended in a draw, but regardless if one of the guys had lost, a result like that wouldn't be detrimental to a guy's career. Don't get me wrong, it's different if you've got an Anthony Joshua or a Conor Benn, but I'm talking here for fighters who are potentially lacking that marketability, that public name recognition, or maybe even that skill set. I think it's great to see these fighters matched. I think it's great to see them take on tougher fights and give them an opportunity to earn a few quid and to build their recognition within the public and to build their marketability by having these kind of fights. Getting a fighter to 20-0 just for him to get chinned the first time he steps up in class, really, really pointless exercise, and I'd rather see them in 50-50 fights where they have a chance to earn a few quid. I'm sure Jez Smith and McGowan earned a little bit more money and gained a few more Twitter followers than if they'd been in a 4-rounder against a journeyman. But that's just my thoughts. Very easy for me to say sitting here on my sofa, but probably turned into a bit of a rant. Those are 10 random things that I would change about the sport. Let me know your take on them. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Are there any things that I've mentioned that you think I've got that wrong? They should actually still be part of the sport. Are there additional things that you'd like to add? It's the things that should be edited, banned, added. You know, give me your thoughts. What would you change on the sport? Do leave your comments in the section below. If you want to support the channel, do take the time to hit the thumbs up button. Do share this via your social media, if you do Facebook, if you do Twitter, whatever. And if you're checking me out for the first time or you haven't subscribed before, please do join the channel and press subscribe. Many thanks for watching, guys. Genuinely appreciate it.